So as we've been discussing, the Hebrew Bible became a book because of some very particular circumstances. For centuries, if not thousands of years, their stories had all been oral tradition, passed down by people, usually from priests down to the next generation of apprentice priests. And that was the only way that a nomadic people could preserve their cultural information. But they eventually did settle down. They came into the Holy Land, battled their way with Canaanites and other native tribes there, and established a homeland for themselves, with the capital of Jerusalem. But they were only there for a couple of centuries when they were conquered, the northern kingdom by the Assyrians, the southern kingdom by the Babylonians. And it was the fall of Jerusalem around 586 BC to the Babylonian Empire that is going to lead to the events that led to the Bible becoming a written book. The main thing is this. For the Babylonians, defeating the Hebrews on the battlefield, that was the easy part. The difficult thing is, how do you keep the peace afterwards? How do you keep people from having an insurgency? Because nobody likes to see foreign troops on their soil. The Assyrians had a brutal method. They just depopulated the area, scattered them across their empire, and they were all separated from their homelands, and the 10 tribes in the north all disappear in history. But the Babylonians had a little more of a lenient attitude about this. They weren't going to tolerate a bunch of violence and rebellions, but their method was to take about 10 or 15% of the population, a small amount of them, all the important and interesting people, the scholars, the intellectuals, any potential leaders, the artisans, pottery makers, and they brought those people back to the home city of Babylon. And this is what's called the Babylonian Captivity. Now, captivity does not mean that they're all in dungeons, because that's expensive. In the ancient world, you needed to run a more cost-efficient empire than that. So they weren't all imprisoned. They simply brought them back to Babylon, and then they found an area outside the walls of Babylon. The king would have said, yeah, out there between those two mountains there, see that valley? All right, it's going to be Hebrew town. You guys go build houses, start farming, set up out there. We'll get you started. And that way the Babylonians could keep an eye on them. Now, this solves all their problems, because the ones that are in Babylon are in foreign territory. They don't know the landscape. They don't have any friends in the area. All they can do is behave themselves and try to stay out of trouble. The majority of the population that you left back in Israel, and you left them there because the only point in conquering land is to have it produce wealth for you. And without people working the land, it doesn't produce any wealth. So they left those people there working. Now those folks are in their home territory. They have friends in the area. They know the secret mountain passes. They could cause problems for you and your territorial governors. But they can't, because even if they do, assassinate some officials and go hide out in the mountains, if the Babylonians can't find them, who are they going to take their anger out on? The people back in Babylon that they're keeping an eye on, which is why they did it. So you divide the people like this, keep an eye on a small group of them nearby, and that means everybody has to keep the peace, right? So that was the Babylonian method for maintaining a peaceable empire after conquest had happened. Now, all of these Hebrews that then came back to Babylon found themselves in the biggest city of its day. In the 6th century BC, Babylon may be the first city in the world that had over 1 million people in its population. And this was a big, thriving, cosmopolitan city with people from all over the world in that area, all speaking different languages. Babylonians were great architects. They built big structures. And the Hebrews found themselves suddenly thrust into this alien, frightening culture. Keep in mind that Jerusalem at its height was really only a medium-sized village by our standards. It was not a huge, sprawling place in antiquity. And now there they are thrust in this 1 million-person city with all kinds of things going on that these very, very morally straight-laced Hebrews were not used to seeing. Okay, these are people that still had their nomadic customs. So they're not used to seeing prostitutes walking down the street and all kinds of drinking and partying and things that they just don't tolerate. So think about it. It's kind of like, if you grew up in an Amish town and suddenly you were thrust in the middle of Los Angeles, the kind of culture shock you would be enduring. Imagine your country Southern Baptist grandma being plucked out of, Apopka and dropped in the middle of LA, and she's got to somehow survive. She'd freak out, right? This is what's happening to the Hebrews. They're surrounded by this wicked, decadent city in their point of view, which is why an expression like the whore of Babylon begins to emerge. So they're terrified by this. And you can see the way that they freak out in a lot of these Bible stories. For example, there's a story called the Tower of Babel, right? Think about it, it's pretty obvious that's a reference to Babylon. And so we have this giant structure, bigger than anything the Hebrews knew how to build, that then was struck down by God and all the languages were scattered. You can see how that story might have emerged as a reaction to being thrust in the middle of a city. Maybe they saw a building collapse and hearing 50 different languages around them which they don't understand and they're not used to. That's how you would digest and express your response to a culture shock of that sort. And there's a variety of things like that that happen. So what are they going to do? The Hebrew patriarchs, the leaders of the society, decided that they've got a problem. They're going to be living outside the walls of this big foreign town, and they don't know how long they're going to be there. Their children are going to be raised outside the walls of the city, their grandchildren. Are they going to still be Hebrews after a while? What happens a couple generations of living within this cultural context? Will our grandchildren even remember our God and the old ways and our customs and traditions, or will they be blended into this cultural melting pot that is Babylon? And they were terrified of that. And the Hebrews had always been kind of xenophobes anyway. They tended to try to avoid contamination from other cultures, as you see throughout the Hebrew Bible. And this is why they made a Hebrew Bible in the first place. They decided that we need to basically take our stories and our culture, our identity, and write it down and make an official book out of it. Because that's something you can hold in front of your kids and say, this is who you are, these are the rules you follow. It's just more substantial, it's more tangible in this way than just dad giving you a lecture talking about the old days. And so they wrote it all down. And this is how the Hebrew Bible gets formed into the book that the Jews now call the Torah and Christians call the Old Testament. Now, when you take all your centuries of oral traditions and put them in a book, you have to make some editorial decisions. When it's all oral tradition, you just have thousands of stories floating in your head and you grab the story you need for the occasion that you're at. But when you write it down, you have to have page 1. You have to have a first chapter. You have to decide how it's going to open, what its themes are going to be. You're freezing this in time forever. So you've got to be very careful about how you shape this material. And so they had to make a lot of editorial decisions. They had to decide how to start the Bible. They didn't have to start it with a creation story. They could have started with the Song of David. They could have begun with some hymns to God to remember the good old days. They could have done it that way. They chose to do it like this for a variety of reasons that we'll explore. And they decided to do basically a chronological narrative, an overall sweep of their culture. So they're going to begin with the earliest, most primordial creation stories, their early folklore, their early mythology, and then build it up to the time of the patriarchs, really beginning with Abraham, the first definitely real historical figure in their tradition, and then follow along from there, embedding certain themes. But you have to remember, they didn't write down every story they knew. They'd still be working on the thing. They selected from their oral tradition, from their memories, a sequence of tales that underscored a particular theme that they wanted to convey. And that theme is something called the covenant. If you grew up going to church, you probably heard that word before. The covenant is the name of the relationship between the Hebrew God and his people. And it's a little different than other ancient cultures. A lot of ancients thought they were almost like biologically descended from their gods. But the Hebrews have this idea that they were chosen by their God that they worship for a special purpose. You could see it the other way. Perhaps the Hebrews chose this as an appropriate deity for them. But unlike most cultures that were polytheistic and worshiped many gods, the Hebrews, while not being exactly monotheistic, they believed other gods were real, they just didn't worship them. They were something called henotheistic. They selected one out of many gods to give their exclusive worship to. And the idea was that they would give exclusive worship to this God and follow his rules and sacrifice only to him. In return, he would spend full time looking out for them and lead them to a great destiny. The promise to Abraham that you will be the father of mighty nations. And so this special relationship that they had has been tested many times because the Hebrews have had a lot of bad times in their history. But the recurring theme is always that even when the chips are down and things are looking terrible, we just got to be faithful because God has a plan. Like in the story of Joseph in Egypt. Here's this nice guy, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, taken to a foreign land, lied about and thrown in prison for something he didn't do. He's hit rock bottom. But in the end, all this worked out because Joseph could interpret dreams. He helps the Pharaoh figure out the dream that leads to the famine that is coming. He saves everybody, including his own people, because the Egyptians have been able to store up their food. And then everybody, it ends all happily at the end of Genesis with them settling down. It looked like all was over, and yet he saved them. And over again, that's the theme that they reinforce in the Bible. Abraham is told to sacrifice his only son. He waited 100 years to have a son, and now he's like a little cute 11, 12-year-old boy, and he's told to sacrifice him. It's going to be the end of his bloodline, right? Terrible for a nomad. And yet at the last minute, God just was testing him, make sure he's loyal, stops him, and his bloodline will continue. That's the recurring theme. Those are the stories that they selected. Stories of near disaster, but because we were faithful, or one hero was good and faithful, God turned it around for us. Because now they're in another disaster. They're outside the walls of Babylon. They saw the Temple of Solomon burned to the ground. They saw Jerusalem largely destroyed. And now they are in a foreign land. It looks to them like all is lost. But if we just stay faithful, God can fix this as well. If you think about it, when they wrote down the 10 Commandments, they could have put them in a variety of orders. But what did they decide ought to be commandment number 1?
No murder.
Have no other God before me, for I am a jealous God. And when you're outside the walls of Babylon, that's probably a good rule to emphasize as number 1, don't you think? Because there's 100 gods worshipped in Babylon, maybe 1,000. So emphasizing that, hey, you guys only worship this God Yahweh. It's probably an important thing to do. So the more you look at it, understanding the historical context of how this got shaped into a written book, a lot of these things start to make more logical sense, more historical sense. Okay? So back to how to begin the Bible. They decided to begin with the creation story, but in fact they end up with 2 creation stories. You might have gone to church your whole life and never noticed that the story of where the world came from is told twice, back to back in the opening chapters of the Bible, and they radically contradict each other in many ways. All right? So let's first of all tease out the differences between these 2 stories. Think about the reading guide notes that you took, and let's figure out the differences, and then we'll talk about why those differences are there. Okay? So the first important question of your reading guide is, what was the condition of things before God begins creating? Now, for some of you, that question seemed kind of strange, because it's like, what do you mean, what was there before? And before he made the world, there was nothing, right? And that's this old tradition called creation ex nihilo, which is a medieval notion. That's why it's in Latin, meaning creation from nothing. And this was how medieval monks and theologians looked at their story, maybe to distinguish it from ancient pagan accounts of creation. It's hard to say, but when you read it carefully, you realize that's not exactly accurate. All right? So everybody get your readers out and look at chapter 1, turn to Genesis 1:1, and let's take a look at what we got. Page 18, or if you're following along in your Bible, Genesis 1:1. It begins like this. In the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while the Spirit of God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. All right. Now, if you have an older Bible translation, that opening verb might say, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then this is how they did it. But when you really analyze that Hebrew verb carefully, it's more accurately rendered as when he began to create. When the process of creation was getting started, these were the conditions of things. Besides that, we all agree that the first act of creation is let there be light, right? At the moment that let there be light is said, what has already been described? What has already been referenced? The situation of it, though. There's water and there's darkness. So we have, in the beginning, the idea of watery darkness. There's no dry land to stand on. There's no light to see by. It's just this raw, unformed, liquid material, and the Spirit of God is moving over it. And your Bibles might translate it as the breath of God or something like that. For the Hebrews, the word for spirit and the word for breath and for wind are all the same word. So you can read it however you want. But basically, it's God's essential spirit moving over the face of this watery darkness about to get started. All right? First thing he does is let there be light. And by making light, what does he do? What is he really creating with light? What is he separating out? What is he separating out by adding light to the darkness? We're not at the sky yet. We only had darkness, now we have light. So now we have night and day. All right. So he creates light, and this creates day and night. All right. So the first thing is to then separate from the darkness. We got to start forming and structuring this material to make it suitable for his creations. So first we're going to separate day and night. Okay. Now, what does he do on the second day? Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. So he made a dome, and he separated the waters above from the waters below the dome. So this dome he makes, what is it actually? The sky. And the Hebrews seem to have seen the sky as like a solid structure, a hemispherical dome going over the top of them. And the sky separates the waters above from the waters below. What are they trying to explain there? Rain, exactly. Because there's waters above the sky and there's waters down here. The Hebrews saw that when it rained, that water that came down was like the waters in lakes and rivers. They had to explain why water's up there and sometimes falls down. So the dome is a barrier, and God releases his storehouses of rain when he chooses to do so. So we get the sky, which also explains rain above and the waters below. So we're starting to separate and structure the waters. We've already structured the darkness a bit. Now we're working on the waters. Okay. Day 3. Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered he called seas. And God saw that it was good, and he said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind, etc. So day 3, these waters, which already exist, again, no, there's no day in which water is created. It's been there since, before he got started. But on day 3, he then gathers the waters below, and therefore land can appear, separated from seas and rivers and such, and then on the land, all the vegetation. So see again this theme of taking this raw material and structuring it. Light to separate the day, a dome to separate the waters, then we gather the waters down there. We're shaping and making this suitable for life. 4 is a very exciting day. God said, let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, and it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. So what do we get on day 4, essentially? The sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, notice that for you with your modern scientific understanding of astronomy, it's rather strange that we would have light appearing 3 days before the sun appeared to provide the light. But these are Bronze Age sheep herders, essentially. They're not modern astronomers, so let's cut them some slack and realize they're trying their best to make sense out of the world around them. Okay? All right. And then God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky. And so he created all the creatures of which 2 habitats, basically? Air creatures, sky, flying creatures, and water creatures. Okay, so creatures that fly, creatures that swim. Day 6. Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind. And it was so. And God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. So day 6 is essentially all the land animals. And then the last thing he makes, sort of the capstone of all of this creation, is he makes humans. And he gives them dominion over everything else that he's made. And we are made, we're told, in his likeness. What exactly that means We don't really know. It's been debated for many, many centuries by theologians and such. What does it mean that we're in the likeness of God? Does he look like us? Does he have nostrils and ears? Is it because we're rational? There's room for debate there. All right. And after all this work, what does he do on day 7? I'm not sure that God sleeps or not. Maybe he does. He rests on that day. Basically, he's done all his chores. It's time for a drink. All right. So this is the first version. At the end of all of this, at verse 2, 4a, and the confusion here for a lot of folks is that this thing, the first story actually bleeds into the beginning of chapter 2. Remember that all of these chapter and verse numbers were not put there by the people who wrote the Hebrew Bible. They were added by medieval monks 1,000 years later. They just wanted a system for tracking the accuracy of all their handwritten copies. All right, so they put them where it made sense to them, but nowadays we find it a little bit awkward. So you go into verse 2, and we have, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. On the 7th day God finished the work that he had done. He continues, so he hallows it, and God blessed the 7th day, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. The end. That's the end of story 1. The final editor of the Bible, whoever finally put all these written accounts together, put a little linking line between these two stories, and that's 2, 4, verse A. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And then listen how to part B of chapter 2, verse 4 begins. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and no herb of the field had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground. But a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the ground. This is a new story. Once upon a time long ago, it's the beginning of a new story. When you make yourself start there with fresh eyes, it's pretty obvious. And the details of the story are quite different. First of all, what was described as being in existence before God begins to create? In the first one, it's watery darkness. What does it now have? We have dry land, dry desert ground. It's not rained. Pretty much the opposite of watery darkness. We now have a desert terrain. What is the first thing God does to start creation?
He creates water.
Yeah, it's a little bit murky.
Yeah,
The phrasing's a little bit murky, but he causes moisture to rise. And once you add moisture to this dry ground, what do you make out of it?
stream.
Well, once you're watering your dry ground, what does your dry ground turn into? Clay, mud, something he can mold like a potter. Okay? So he takes this new mud mixture that he's made, and what's the first thing he makes? Try again. Does he make all humans? He makes Adam. He only makes Adam. He makes a man, calls him Adam. The name Adam in Hebrew means red earth. His name is basically a description of the material that he was made from. And he gives the breath of life to Adam. Okay? Then what does he make? Makes the Garden of Eden, makes all the other stuff basically. We're going to get the garden. We're going to get the animals. And then there's this really sweet detail in which Adam gets to help God a little bit in the process of establishing the world. What does Adam get to do? He gets to name the animals. So God doesn't tell him what he made. He presents each animal to Adam, and Adam says, let's call that a giraffe, right? And he comes up with names for them. So there's this like close intimacy between God and the first man right there at the beginning. So Adam gets to name the animals. But then there's a problem, because all the animals have male and female, but that is not the case yet for Adam. And he needs a suitable partner. And none of the animals are really suitable for him, so God's got to figure out something else to do. And so that's when he puts him to sleep, pulls out his rib, and from his rib makes him a mate from his own body named Eve. Okay? Adam and Eve are put in the garden, and they're given exactly one rule to follow. What's their one rule? Don't eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. All right, well, it's going to take them about another page or so to break that rule. The only thing they had to obey. And who causes them to do that? The serpent. So the serpent, through his conniving, tricks Eve into eating from this fruit. Her eyes are open. She gives some to Adam. He eats as well. And they basically gain moral awareness. And then God realizes this, not so good. And we have expulsion from the garden. And the curses that come down upon them. Men have to work hard by the sweat of their brow now. You don't just have fruit falling from the tree. Women have intense pain in childbirth. And the serpent, while everything else has legs, the serpent has to crawl on its belly and eat dust. And so this is, again, called an etiology, a myth that explains the origin of weird details of the world. How come animals just roam around and eat, but we got to work so hard? How come female animals just kind of spit out their offspring? Human women have so much pain. And how come serpents crawl on the ground? Everything else has got legs. Etiologies are stories that explain those curious details about the world. So we get a few of those in here as well. Okay, so notice the stark differences between these two stories. One begins in watery darkness, the other in dry desert ground. One begins creation by making light, the other by making moisture. And human beings come into the world in very different ways. In the first version, they're made at the same time at the very end of creation. In the second version, the male Adam is made first, and Eve comes at the end after everything else is made. So they have two different stories to account for the same things. And unlike the flood stories, because there's also two versions of the flood story that are kind of integrated together, they're sort of woven into one narrative, the creation stories were too different to weave together. They couldn't reconcile them. So they just wrote one and then they wrote the other one. And you know what? That did not bother them at all. It bothers modern people when they notice this, because we're used to having fact checkers and continuity editors, and we want to know why there's an inconsistency here. But that is the habit of very literate people. Because you all read and write, you have scholarly habits that the ancients weren't concerned about. Only a few people knew how to read and write. And the importance of any story you tell is that there's some important truth. There's some cultural function to that story. And both of these stories are important. Both of them have some truths to convey. In the first version, what is kind of the overall image you get, the overall theme, compared to what's different about the second one? Yeah. So we notice that detail, and it's kind of curious when you first notice that. But all of this, we see kind of God's cosmic power. This is the amazing God creating the whole universe. This is a very cosmic creation story. This one, we don't get references to sun and moon and stars and things like that. What is the focus of the second version? It's about human beings and
Their relation with God.
how they got into their problematic relationship with God. So it's all about the relationship between the divine and humanity and why it is the way that it is. Okay, so both of these are important things to emphasize, and that's why they put them both there. They put one after another. Right? In an oral tradition, it's really no big deal at all. You just tell whatever stories you need at the time. They wrote it down, and it didn't really bother them about this either. What's also interesting about this is that only one of these stories is really the ancient Hebrew original oral tale that they've passed down for generations until it got written down. And one of these stories shows a lot of Babylonian influence. There's a whole lot of details of it that reflect the fact that they're outside the walls of Babylon, and they're probably talking to Babylonian scholars, and scholars talk to scholars. They're international communities typically. And so there's details of the Babylonian world that's finding its way in there as well. So this is the fun thing to do. Everybody take a minute, look at each of these stories, think about the differences, and then I'll ask for a show of hands and vote. How many of you think that this one is the original Hebrew story, the most ancient of the stories, and we think this is the older story that the Hebrews brought with them? Take a minute and think about that. Okay, let's have a show of hands. How many of you, raise your hand if you think that this is the more ancient tale that the Hebrews brought with them from time immemorial? I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, about half of you. Vote if you think this is the more ancient and original Hebrew story. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Good, we're almost evenly split. We can have fun. All right, so now we're going to debate this a little bit. And I'm going to ask you for the reasons. What is the evidence that led you to vote one way or the other? Give me your best arguments and see if you can convince people on the other side to join your team. We're very polarized here in America. All we do is yell at each other. When it comes to politics, let's practice the art of civil discourse. See if we can disagree and persuade each other to come out of their deeply rooted positions, shall we? All right, good thing to do in an election year. All right, so those of you that argue that the first one is the more ancient original Hebrew tale, what are your reasons for this? Anybody?
So for one, the one that struck me most was in the second story. We talked about how the serpent is, trying to trick them, which comes from Babylonian culture, where they thought that serpents were all, they stole, like you said, they stole the, recreate,
The rejuvenating life force.
Life from them, so they
Exactly.
accuse serpents as evil.
Okay, so we got a serpent in this one. The Epic of Gilgamesh has a serpent that tricks humans out of eternal life. Exactly. So, okay, so we got a serpent parallel. So that would make this one more Hebrew, and they're by default, or this one more Babylonian, so by default, that's more Hebrew. Okay, good argument. Yes, sir.
That was it's less complex, I guess. There's less complex details, right? It's very like broad strokes, like the sky, the earth, the creatures, people, done.
Okay.
Whereas the other one has like a little bit more, I don't know, knowledge to it on like broad, like there's like talking about like all the animals and like the
More
gardens,
detail.
stuff like that. It's a little bit more, I don't know, complex, which I feel like if you're going from nomads to you're now living in Babylon.
Okay. So as a nomad, when you've got to remember everything and you don't have a bunch of big books to carry around, you want to keep it short and sweet, keep it nice and simple, right? Now when you settle down, we're going to write down, we can elaborate on the details. So we get this one. Okay, good. More arguments for why you prefer this one as the original.
In the second story, it goes into, like he was talking about, a lot of details specifically about like the rivers. Like they each have like the name of each river, and what like their deal is and where they flow out from and what they're next to. And that might have been something like they either really knew about or cared about in the original story.
Okay, and they mention rivers, including the Tigris and Euphrates, that are in Babylon and are geographical references from the Middle East. And this one doesn't mention anything like that at all. Okay, good. All right, let's take a look at the second version. Those of you that argue that this is the more ancient Hebrew version, what are your reasons?
I noticed that a lot of stories that are related to ancient, they have like a reason or like a moral to it. The moral for that story would be to kind of like always obey God, because now you have consequences. So I figured that maybe that one would be,
Okay. So for the Hebrews, this is a very important object lesson about obeying God, whereas this doesn't really have any moral point to it. It's just a big description. Good argument.
So my whole reasoning is a lot of humans typically tend to be very conceited, and so I feel like they would be more concerned about like how they came about than how the rest of the universe came about.
Okay, so the more human focus of it is just typically what ancient humans would have done. Correct? The Babylonians might have had the same thing, but this is a lot of particular Hebrew references. It's about them. And you're right, all literature is about ourselves. We always write about ourselves, no matter what we're writing about. Okay, good. More arguments for this one. Anybody? Eddie, y'all voted for it. What are your reasons? Yes, sir.
Seeing the name, and I'm starting to rethink it now that the cosmic ones seem more focused on like one God, rather than you said they were henotheistic.
Mm-hmm.
They believed in other gods, they just didn't worship them.
Right.
And it seems like in the second version, that's more focused like on men and like the human characteristics, maybe like why they would be chosen by their God.
Okay, so that henotheistic covenant theme of being chosen, we see that relationship beginning right here. Okay, good. Very good. All good arguments. And really, I mean, both of these are Hebrew stories now. It's just that one of them we see some background elements that came in from the Babylonians. All right, any final arguments for either one? Anybody having any insights? Yes, sir.
That one's written first. Like,
That it comes first. Okay, so they put their oldest one first.
Yes.
All right? Yeah.
It is easier to put things first
It's easier what?
It is first. It is easier to put this word at the beginning
Mm-hmm.
than to edit all the rest. So probably that was added later. And the thing that really
Wait, so you're looking at the opposite. You're looking at the same evidence, but taking the opposite inference from it, that the stuff that they added later is easier just to put it at the beginning because the rest of it's going to then continue and be all connected together.
And the thing
Okay,
that caught
good.
my eye was, why women came second, or the woman.
Yes, and the Hebrews are a very patriarchal and misogynistic society, but they're hardly unique in that. Pretty much everyone in the ancient world was that way to some degree. But it doesn't really just come up here at all. Okay, I'm going to take a second vote of hands, and then we'll talk about which is which and why. Has anybody changed their mind? One yes so far? Okay, so let's have a second round of votes. How many think this is still the original ancient Hebrew story? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, how many think this is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Everybody did vote, right? Okay, so this group has convinced one person to switch sides and join them. All right, good. So you ready for the answer? The original, ancient, primordial Hebrew creation story that traveled with them from the dawn of time through all kinds of trial and tribulations until finally getting written down in Babylon. The ancient story is number 2. So one of you were misled by some slick rhetoric. Why? Let me sum this up quickly here, about out of time. First of all, and you made some of the good points here, this one does focus on God and the human relationship. This is very much the beginning of that whole covenant-themed story about how we have this difficult relationship with God because we keep being disobedient, right? Secondly, oral tradition, remember, if you have to remember a story, you have to have memorable characters. Stories need a hero. You need to have a Joseph. You need to have a Moses, right? And that hero is going to be an underdog with some powers. He's going to have some adventures. But here we have named characters. Right? Thirdly, this line does connect to the rest of the Bible. You're quite right. And it was easier then to take the thing they're adding and put it at the beginning. Otherwise, they'd have to start the story, pivot over to here, and then pivot back to the narrative going down through the line of the patriarchs, right? What makes this one specifically Babylonian? There's a couple of things. First of all, that it begins in watery darkness. Almost everybody's creation mythology in antiquity begins with watery darkness. It's what the Greeks would have called chaos, unformed matter. And most ancient mythologies survive because they came from cities with illiterate people, and these cities have farms and they're built on rivers. So they're used to having water nearby. So the Babylonian story begins with taming Apsu and Tiamat. The Egyptian story begins with water until Aten-Re starts to dry it up. The Greeks begin pretty much with chaos. So they're all like this. This is unusual. To have creation beginning with dry desert ground, that's a rare kind of thing. But the Hebrews are a rare example of ancient nomads whose stories got written down and survived. We don't really have a lot of nomads leaving literature and paper trails to posterity. And so if you're a nomad and you're always moving your animals around, you're always looking for a watering hole. You're always looking for, grassy fields to graze your cattle on. And so for you, creation begins when God sends that blessed moisture that allows you to keep your animals going. So apparently that's how a nomad would have seen it. Not a lot of things to compare that to, but there's a lot of things from other cities you can compare this to. That's from city folks. Also, we get evidence of the fact that the Babylonians were a more highly literate people, and that they had developed science. Like on day 4, the sun, the moon, and the stars, these lights were created for signs and for seasons. The Babylonians are some of the first great astronomers that tracked the heavenly bodies and used that to calculate their position in the universe in a geocentric world, but they're the first ones to observe and track the movements of these things. And so that kind of reference there is a reminder of Babylonian astronomy. We also get a sense of their literacy levels by the very fact that it's a numbered list. You don't think about this because you're also literate, you make lists and it's no big deal, but if you were illiterate, you couldn't make a grocery list, could you? If you had to get 15 things at the grocery store and you couldn't write them down, how would you remember what to get? You either make a rhyming song out of it, or you make a story out of it. And then you go through the story of what I'm going to cook this week, and you remember it that way. And this is a story. But having this enumerated list, that is a habit of literate people who write things down in this way. And to become literate, it's not going to occur to you to make numbered lists of things like this at all. Okay? As is the fact that it is specifically a list of 7. And why 7? Yeah, but why would you make a 7-day week in the first place? Well, I will upload a video for you to watch this weekend on the origin of the mystical number 7 in Western civilization. Those of you watching out in YouTube world, go see my next video on mystical number 7. Class dismissed.